Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute present The Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter. If you like us, please help us by subscribing and by reviewing us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might listen. And don't forget to sign up for weekly updates and study questions at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.
Welcome back to the Formed Book Club, where Stephen Judo, Joseph Pierce, and myself are discussing In Defense of Sanity, the best essays of G.K. Chesterton, as determined by none other than Dale Alquist, Joseph Pierce, and Aidan Mackey. We continue, but a little forewarning, because of various engagements that Vivian and Joseph and I have, we're taking a 6-week break, and we'll be back on August 23rd with the Formed Book Club, continuing with the best essays of G.K. Chesterton. And this week, we start with the essay on vulgarity. And I think our local expert on that would be Joseph Pierce. So,
because he's a man of the people, Father.
Yeah, exactly. I can speak with authority on vulgarity because of my Cockney accent. That's what I say. So, actually, I do actually have the first couple of sentences highlighted. So if I can read those and maybe comment upon them.
all right.
Most of us must have wondered if we could find a real definition of vulgarity. For it is generally difficult to destroy or even to defy a thing that we cannot define. I suspect, to begin with, that we should discover, in the case of this word, a difficulty that exists with regard to a great many modern words. They were invented after the age of doctrine and definition. They are at best artistic and atmospheric. So I think he hits a very important point here, is that we don't live in a culture anymore that defines terms, and many of the terms that we use are indefinable. So it makes it somewhat difficult when you want to actually reason with someone and engage them with words when even the words themselves now don't seem to have any definite meaning. And of course, this has played into the hands of the deconstructionists and the radical relativists. So I think part of our business is to define our terms and to defend the definite. And I think that's really what Chesterton's doing here in this essay, is to defend the definite and to get to grips with vulgarity, and indeed the vulgarity that leads to the inability to define words such as vulgarity.
Well, this is related to an essay we'll talk about subsequently, when he characterizes the medieval period as one of thesis, as opposed to the modern period, one of essay, where with a thesis, you have to define your terms and make an argument, whereas with an essay, you can just wonder. He's kind of self-deprecating because he's an essayist. Secondly, I had this thought this morning, whether it was a result of prayer or just being sleepy after waking up, and I put it this way: if you don't believe in God, you will cease believing in man. And what I realized I meant by, I reflected on my own thought, was that if you don't believe that things are ordained and created according to some law outside themselves, God, if they're merely artifacts of, not even artifacts, because that's something made, if they're chance and random mutations and so on, then there's no natures to things. There's nothing which is a solid structural basis for anything, including ourselves. So if we stop believing in God, and then we therefore don't believe in a nature which is lawful and therefore obeys certain laws, then words don't have meaning either, and we don't have meaning, and everything is up to your narrative. What your narrative is. When I heard that word nowadays, I cringed because, well, here's the narrative. Well, what happened? Well, that's his narrative. No, that's your narrative. Anyway, I think this is related to what you said, Joseph, and he said here, that we should really define our terms if we're going to have an argument or a discussion or even a conversation.
Well, I think arguing over terms is not altogether that new, because I think even in the scholastic era that they were arguing over terms. But you're right that in order to have a conversation or a good argument, you do need to take the trouble to try to define them. But his choice of talking about vulgarity sort of reminded me of the famous Supreme Court justice in one of the famous obscenity cases in the United States, who they were trying to define pornography and obscenity in court in order to decide what fell within those statutes and what was protected speech. And one of the judges said about pornography, well, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it.
Right. And Aristotle also famously said that in things human, what is true for the most part. That is, there's always blurry edges on things, but the blurry edges don't mean that things don't exist. For example, it's really hard to determine whether some things are plants or animals.
Mm-hmm. Like take or animals and birds, like take a platypus, both a mammal and a beak.
Exactly right. But in the case of animals or plants, you can tell a kangaroo from a cactus. I mean, there's no problem there. But then when you get towards the borderline, then it's a little harder to tell. Or is a virus a living organism or not? I'm not sure even what the scientists say about that. But that does not, just because there's hard cases, does not mean the law is not clear. It just means that there's some things we don't know. Here's another example I'll give. No one would mistake the Pacific Ocean for the San Francisco Bay. And yet, if you ask the question, well, where does the ocean stop and the bay start? Well, the Golden Gate Bridge? Well, which side of the bridge? Right in the center of the bridge? Or maybe you even though there's nothing clearer than the distinction between the the Pacific Ocean and the San Francisco Bay, you cannot determine exactly where the dividing line is. I'm wondering. As the eldest of the three here, I
think that's all play excellently upon the whole idea of trying to define terms and understand reality, which is what this is about. And certainly when we're talking about words, he does follow the correct procedure, the correct process, shall we say, because he does go back to the Latin vulgus and distinguish between the modern word vulgarity doesn't really connect with the understanding of the root word vulgus, with profane and vulgus mean the common crowd, because actually it's not about that which is common. It's about, and he uses the analogy, the metaphor on the next page well, let me actually quote it rather than get it wrong. So when the mind stretches itself in order to show off and is still stunted, like a dwarf, that is the revelation that I mean. It is by showing off that we see how little there is to show. A thing is only vulgar when its best is base. I mean, I think that's a perfect definition of what he's getting at, which is not the same thing as, we know that Chesterton loves the common man. So when he's criticizing vulgarity, he's not criticizing the vulgar in that older understanding of the word.
He's defending the common man from being the brunt of the word vulgarity. He knows very well that the word vulgarity comes from vulgus, which means the common man. And, he lives in a very classist society, and he's always sticking up for the little guy. We're not going to, just make the little guy into the basis for what we understand as vulgar or common. What he's going to do is bring down the high guy by showing his arrogance.
Although paradoxically, this might be the only essay he ever wrote where he actually shows up the limitations of the small guy. Because, the metaphor he uses here is when, what I mean by vulgarity is this: when six men stand up and we suddenly see that one of them is a dwarf, we are startled to find him so stunted. We only realize that he is stunted because he is standing up, because he is stretching himself to his full height. And that's when he goes on to say, when the mind of man stretches itself in order to show off and is still stunted, That is the revelation that I mean. In other words, the dwarf here is being used as a metaphor for the vulgar, who stands up as big as he can to show off, and in so doing shows he has nothing to show.
Yeah,
Well,
I can't argue with that. It's
no, but I think that's not, he's not there by demeaning ordinary people or common men and women
No.
and children, but rather to say, if you are something, including an ordinary person, and you try and become more than you really are, or you're trying to stretch yourself and be what you're not, then that's vulgar.
Yeah, that's what I was certainly trying to say.
Well, interesting. This another on a more meta level here. Chesterton obviously is someone who knows words and loves words and reflects on words and their use. And so here's an essay just on the word vulgarity, in which he reveals, levels of understanding that are worth exploring. And again, to me, this makes Chesterton kind of a mentor or a guide, is that we should love words as well, and we should think about what we say and what the words mean. And we shouldn't simply be idly listening to Muzak, when we're driving the car, but might be thinking about the words we use. I don't know. I'm reading.
Well, as we're going to see later when he talks about euphemisms and some of these other expressions, free love, companionate, divorce, and all this other nonsense, he knows that words have power, that the abuse of language is actually a form of power. And in a society like England, where, the taste of the more common individual is called vulgar, for Chesterton to say, no, what's vulgar is when you show off and you're shown to be a shallow person,
Yes.
He's fighting back against this use of language to keep people in their place.
Well, yeah, and also I do see a connection here between this discussion of vulgarity and that wonderful talk by Chesterton, which I'm sure I've referenced more than once in our discussions, when Chesterton said that the coming peril is standardization by a low standard, because that's basically what we've been seeing, the standardization by a low standard, and the consequence of that is the arrogance of ignorance. And I think the arrogance of ignorance, people that are not educated but think they are, that is the mark of vulgarity.
And that's exactly how he defines it. That's right. I may forget it later on, so I'll say it now because it relates to the theme we're talking about, euphemism and so on. The late, wonderful Monsignor Bill Smith of New York, who was a wonderful moral theologian and a great wit, would say often that social engineering is always preceded by linguistic engineering. So, it's they're terminating a pregnancy. We're not killing a child.
Yep. And that's exactly the point that Chesterton makes in one of these later essays. Exactly so. He says it in a slightly different way, but he says the same thing.
Yep. Well, let's get there.
We'll get there.
On a humiliating heresy. A little quote from the beginning there, page 187. Popular preachers and fashionable novelists can safely repeat that men are only what their destiny makes them, and that there is no choice or challenge in the lot of men. He's talking here about this idea that we're determined, but I'm not sure if that's really a current climate of thought right now. I think we're more in the arena where everything is undetermined and you can become whatever you want just by choosing to be that. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, the heresy he's talking about is the belief that there's no free will. Right. And there's different ways you can deny a man his free will. You can either be deterministic about it, either through environmental determinism or heredity or things like that. But there are other ways you can deprive people of choice too, by saying they're not as smart and as clever as we are, so they don't know any better, so we have to choose for them. I mean, there's other ways. And what's humiliating about all these forms of depriving human beings of free will, it's humiliating because he says it's basically saying we're slaves. Why would anybody want to be a slave?
Well, there's also another consequence of having no free will, and that's madness. And of course, one reason I like this essay is we have Chesterton waxing on Shakespeare, which I always enjoy. But he talks about this distinguished doctor has written a book about the madness of Shakespeare, and then on page 189, about how this medical doctor, medical gentleman, as Chesterton calls him, calls basically a string of Shakespeare's characters mad. So Macbeth was mad, Hamlet was mad, Ophelia was congenitally mad, and so on. If Hamlet was really mad, there does not seem much point in his pretending to be mad.
That's right.
If Ophelia was always mad, there does not seem much point in her going mad. But anyhow, I think a saner criticism will always maintain that Hamlet was sane. He must be sane even in order to be sad. But when we get into a world of complete unreality, even tragedy is unreal. So the whole point is, of course, that madness is the absence of free will. We're no longer able to make consciously rational decisions. You know, we're slave to our madness. And of course, Shakespeare is always this definer and defender of freedom in the sense that we are responsible for our actions and there are consequences to our actions.
Right. Well, and he's showing that that this tendency in criminal psychology to assume that the criminal is sick or insane or mad, that now you're depriving the freedom to choose to do an evil thing. And of course, he uses Macbeth for this example that, oh my goodness, this is just such brilliant analysis and writing, saying that just because someone is influenced doesn't mean he was forced. He says this on 190, especially when you choose to be influenced, right? And Macbeth chooses to be influenced by the witches, right? He chooses to be enticed and seduced by the idea of being a king and freely chooses to murder in order to do so. And to call him insane is actually depriving the story of its power, for one thing, but Macbeth of his humanity.
And it removes the moral from the whole tragedy. In fact, it ceases to be a tragedy, as Chesterton says. And that's why I like, Hamlet is the anti-Macbeth, because Hamlet does the same thing. He also receives supernatural vision, the ghost of his father, but then he chooses to rationally ask questions and do things and stage plays to find out if the ghost is honest. Right? So, am I going to believe this? He could be telling me lies. So it's the employment of reason. And again, I love he says, the whole point of Hamlet is that he is really saner than anybody else in the play. That's the whole point. So, the one who's mad is really the one who's sane. And of course, this is another recurring motif. But I love the end of this when he basically points the finger at the doctor.
Yes.
But after all, Hamlet pretended to be mad in order to deceive fools. We cannot complain if he has succeeded.
I was going to.
And that's that's the funny part, right? We're all laughing when we read that part, but he ends on a very on a darker note here on 191, because he says that it has been used by materialists, he calls it the false series of things, that just because things are in a row, that there's causality between them. And he says in the end that it has been used by materialists in many ways to destroy the sense of moral liberty, and it has murdered many more things besides Duncan.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Yep.
My only quibble with it is that I think that he makes Sophocles more fatalist than Sophocles is. I think the point of the Oedipus cycle is to show that if things happen that beyond your control, are you culpable for them? That's not the same thing as saying that there's nothing but fate. And because in the final play, Oedipus at Colonus, the whole point is that the gods bless him because he comes to accept and embrace his suffering, even though most of his suffering is not his fault. So it's about culpability, but it's not about the absence of sin.
Right. I even think that Oedipus is more responsible for the murder of his father than sometimes the interpretation gives. Because if you lose your temper and murder a man,
Well, he was outnumbered, and it was self-defense.
well,
Anyway,
it's kind of a case of road rage. But in any case, so the real great literature does this, right? It explores the complexity of being human and shows that on one hand we have free will, on other hand we do have compromised will. It's not so cut and dry. But to deprive man of freedom altogether by saying he's just an animal, he's just bent one way or another by forces beyond his control, he's a machine, and on it goes. I think Chesterton would agree that whatever fatalism the Greeks might have accepted about life, the modern determinism and refusal to give man his freedom is way worse.
Yeah, well, it is.
I knew a man, a very wealthy man, who bought the patent for the ballpoint pen back in the late 40s and became very, very wealthy because of it. And he became an alcoholic. He spent most of that money to fund studies in order to prove that alcoholism had no moral content. It was all a question of the length of your colon or your intestines, and your hereditary, your genes, and so on. He had to prove to himself that there was no moral component to this. Well, it's true. There's a lot of determinism in any kind of an addiction, but it can't be totally determined. Otherwise, there's no human life. There's no story anymore. It's all destiny. I want to say something on page 190. This is a little bit the remark, maybe not central to what he's saying here, but I think it has illustrates something, which is a problem that's ongoing. About 5 lines down the new paragraph there, he says, almost all our pseudoscience proceeds on the principle of saying that one thing follows on another thing, and then dogmatizing about the third thing that is to follow. Now, when I was younger, because we had several decades of cooling temperatures, there was at least a nationwide campaign against global cooling because people thought we were going to go back to another ice age. Now we've had a couple of successive warm periods, maybe we have, depending on the data, and therefore we're gonna say we have global warming is catastrophic and it's coming. But every time you get 2 points on a graph, they want to make the third point. So the stock market goes up by 10%. Well, it's going to go up 20%. It's the science can predict some things pretty well. For example, when water is going to boil at sea level and so on. But the future is not something even in the material world which we can easily predict, even though the material world is largely deterministic, although quantum mechanics is basically a question even that. Anyway, I just went, can you edit this thing down, Thomas, when I'm finished? All right, Dixie, I've spoken. Let's go on. Unless you have something else to say about this essay. Anybody?
Fine to move on.
We've exhausted it. We've exhausted ourselves. We've exhausted any listeners who are still here. On original sin. Anyone?
Well, he sets up this contrast between H.G. Wells and Aldous Huxley. The one thing he can't believe is original sin, and the one thing he can believe is original sin. And so it's a fun way to start an essay, isn't it? Kind of pitting two contemporary authors, both whom are so famous, and most of us have probably read works by them too. To pit them against each other is a great way to begin an essay, I think.
Yeah, and again, it's the optimism of one versus the pessimism of the other. And Aldous Huxley, some form of original sin seems to explain the mess which is humanity. Whereas, of course, H.G. Wells is doing exactly what Father was saying in the discussion of the previous essay, presuming from putting 2 points on the graph, the ascent of man is inevitable, inexorable, and will lead to a golden age in the future. And again, we do need to remind ourselves this last book, which was written in 1945, just after the end of World War II and the genocide and the atom bomb and the rest of it. It was called The Mind at the End of Its Tether. So H.G. Wells was disillusioned with his own optimism by the end of his life.
Oh, that's a good thing to know.
Reminds me of.
But then Chesterton always takes it to another level. Is that where you're going, Father?
Well, I was going to say that it was a famous citation of Teilhard de Chardin that everything that rises must converge. That we're moving towards the noosphere. It's all getting, and of course, Flannery O'Connor used that as the title of one of her short stories, which made it very clear that because of original sin, we cannot say that everything that rises must converge. In fact, you read the book of Revelation, it looks like things begin to diverge pretty drastically and catastrophically as time goes on because of original sin. But the good news, and that's what I love about Flannery O'Connor, they call her grotesque in what she writes. Maybe it is grotesque, but she sees grace in the grotesqueness of human life. She sees redemption even in the middle of the most horrendous sins. And to me, that's the Christian message.
Amen. Yeah. So again, I think he says here, that Aldous Huxley, he sort of gets it right instinctively, but then he says something that's scientific, which is actually nonsense. So Aldous Huxley adds that the scientific view of man, this is towards the bottom of page 193, Aldous Huxley adds that the scientific view of man necessitates a sort of original sin if it be only the residuum of his animal ancestry. And I think this is his main point here. Now that is exactly where I should like him to advance a step further, and he does not. For sin, whatever else it is not merely the dregs of a bestial existence. It is something more subtle and spiritual, and is in some way connected with the very supremacy of the human spirit. And then the beginning of the next paragraph, the worst things in man are only possible to man. At least we must find their existence to men unless you are prepared to admit the existence of demons. In other words, sin is not something bestial, but something demonic. It's something spiritual and evil and wicked. You can't accuse a lion or a tiger of being wicked because they are merely obeying their natural instinct. But the whole point about sin is that we are freely choosing to do something ultimately diabolical.
And in that sense, we actually fall below the animals because at least they do obey the nature God gave them. And when we sin, we're disobeying. So yes, and that's just what he does, right? He just so deftly moves to a higher plane and takes the conversation to another place. And he does it so brilliantly.
Good.
Well,
let's move on to Jane Austen in the general election. And I'm going to leave it to you two literary scholars or aficionados, amateurs in the good sense, to comment on this. I've read Jane Austen, but I forget what I read.
As this is Jane Austen, I'm certainly going to let the ladies go first.
Oh, well, you're a gentleman, Joseph.
Thank you.
What's so great about this is that, as Chesterton shows, most of the people who cite Jane Austen, at least in his time, probably never read her, saw instead a feminine ideal from an age which she herself never aspired to, but in fact, her heroines always had fine qualities of mind and everything else like that, unless their foolishness is an opportunity for personal growth, which many of her heroines grow through the story, But he really takes it up a notch when he points to the nonsense of modern women seeing through the duplicity of Mr. Wickham. So the whole basis of the essay is these moderns are trying to denigrate the feminine ideal in Jane Austen, even though they're mischaracterizing it and it's not her ideal. Nevertheless, they have this idea in their mind. But then when they try to elevate the modern woman above this woman, then Chesterton really goes after them, doesn't he, Joseph?
He does indeed. And the point is, he makes it perfectly clear that Mr. Wickham would have a field day with the modern woman.
Yes.
Mr. Wickham would certainly not fool Jane Austen any more than ultimately he fooled Elizabeth Bennet when it comes out, right? But for the modern woman, and he says, Mr. Wickham, we see Mr. Wickham all the time. He's in Parliament. He's very successful in elections because people vote for him, because people don't see through him. That's the whole point. And the fact that Jane Austen is a genius in giving us a character like Mr. Wickham, and that Jane Austen is much more of a genius, and feminine or otherwise, than the modern woman.
Yes. And the way he ends it with these characters of so vividly, this starts on 199. So vividly do I see Mr. Wickham as a politician that I feel inclined to rewrite the whole of Pride and Prejudice to suit the politics of today. It would be amusing to send the Bennet girls rushing around to canvass, Elizabeth with amusement and Jane with dignified reluctance. As for Lydia, she would be a great success in modern politics. But her husband would be her husband being Mr. Wickham, would be the greatest success of all, and he might become a cabinet minister, while poor old Darcy was sulking in the provinces, a decent, truthful, honorable diehard, cursing the taxes and swearing the country was going to the dogs, and especially to the puppies. Oh man, that is just so brilliant.
And certainly, that the character in Pride and Prejudice that's most like the bright young things that even more satirizes 100 years after Jane Austen's novel is Lydia. I mean, Lydia is the bright young thing, the modern girl, right, who wants to do her own thing, that won't be bound by moral convention. And she's the one who makes a complete fool of herself, and she's the one that's hoodwinked by the cynical, duplicitous characters.
Yep, it's great stuff.
Well, maybe we should end on that so we can begin after the break with Chesterton's essay on essays. How does that sound?
Sounds great.
Sounds perfect. You want to remind them again of when we return?
All right, so we will return on, God willing, Deo Volente, as we used to say, and some still say, on August 23rd. See you all then. God bless you. Thanks for listening and watching the Formed Book Club.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Formed Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.